The blood was still wet on her trembling hands when the crowd found her standing over the body, and their accusations rang through the dusty Montana street like church bells announcing doom. Sarah Mitchell had never imagined her life would lead to this moment in the summer of 1876, standing in the middle of Copper Ridge with 3 men dead at her feet and a smoking revolver clutched in her shaking fingers. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the small mining town nestled in the mountains, and the dust hadn't even settled from the violence that had erupted mere moments before. Her dark hair had come loose from its careful pins, falling wild around her shoulders, and her simple calico dress was torn at the sleeve where rough hands had grabbed her. "Murderer!" someone in the growing crowd shouted, and others took up the cry. "She killed them in cold blood!" "String her up!" Sarah's legs felt like they might give out beneath her. Her heart hammered so hard in her chest she thought it might burst right through her ribs. She tried to speak, to explain, but her throat had gone dry as the Montana dirt beneath her boots. The faces surrounding her were twisted with rage and fear, people she'd seen at the general store and the church on Sundays, now looking at her like she was something monstrous. The 3 men on the ground had been drifters who'd ridden into town 2 days prior. They'd seemed friendly enough at first, paying for their drinks at the saloon and keeping mostly to themselves. But Sarah had felt their eyes on her whenever she walked past, had seen the way they watched her when she carried her basket to the mercantile. That afternoon, they'd followed her when she'd taken the path toward her small cabin at the edge of town, the one she'd lived in alone since her father died in a mining accident 6 months earlier. They'd cornered her in the alley behind the blacksmith's shop. She could still feel where their hands had grabbed her, could still hear their ugly laughter when she'd tried to fight them off. The biggest one had torn her sleeve, had pressed her against the rough wooden wall while the others moved in closer. She'd managed to break free for just a moment, had run toward the main street, but they'd caught her again. That's when she'd seen it, lying in the dirt where someone must have dropped it during a scuffle, a revolver with its handle gleaming in the sunlight. She'd grabbed it without thinking. When the first man lunged at her, she'd pulled the trigger. The gun had kicked back so hard, it nearly flew from her grip, but she'd held on. The man had stumbled backward, surprise written across his face. His companions had frozen for just a heartbeat before drawing their own weapons. She'd fired again and again, her body moving on pure instinct, on the desperate need to survive. Now they were dead, and she was standing here with their blood literally on her hands, and no one wanted to hear her side of the story. "Wait!" The voice that rang out was deep and commanding, cutting through the angry shouts like an axe through pine. "All of you, wait just 1 damn minute!" The crowd parted and Sarah saw him for the first time. He was the biggest man she'd ever laid eyes on, easily 6.5 feet tall with shoulders so broad they seemed to block out the sun. His hair was dark brown and hung past his collar, slightly wild like he'd been running his hands through it. His face was weathered and strong, with a thick beard that couldn't hide the firm set of his jaw. He wore buckskin trousers and a leather vest over a rough cotton shirt, and his arms were bare below the elbows, showing muscles that looked like they'd been carved from the very mountains themselves. A large hunting knife hung at his belt, and he carried a rifle with the ease of someone who'd been born with a weapon in his hands. Sarah had heard of him, though she'd never seen him up close. Everybody in Copper Ridge knew about Caleb Stone, the mountain man who lived somewhere up in the high country, who came down to town maybe 4 times a year to trade furs and buy supplies. They said he'd lived alone in the wilderness for nearly 10 years, that he could track anything that walked or crawled, that he was tougher than leather and twice as hard to kill. He walked straight through the crowd like they weren't even there, his boots heavy on the packed dirt, and stopped a few feet from Sarah. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, and they swept over her, taking in her torn dress, her wild hair, the bruises already forming on her arms. Then he looked down at the 3 dead men, studying them with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen plenty of death in his time. "She murdered them!" the blacksmith shouted. "We all saw her standing there with the gun." Caleb turned slowly, fixing the blacksmith with a stare that could have frozen water in July. "What you saw was the end of something, not the beginning. Any of you bother to look at her before you started hollering for a rope?" "They're dead, Stone. That's all that matters," another man said, though his voice lacked conviction. "That's so?" Caleb moved closer to Sarah, and she instinctively took a step back. He held up one massive hand, palm out, showing he meant no harm. "Let me see your arms," he said quietly. and something in his tone made her obey. She held out her arms, and he gently turned them to show the crowd the finger-shaped bruises, the scrapes on her wrists where rough hands had grabbed her. Look at her dress. Look at her face. Sarah realized she had tears streaming down her cheeks, though she hadn't felt herself start crying. Her whole body was shaking now, the terror and shock finally catching up with her. "These men attacked her," Caleb said, his voice carrying authority that made the crowd listen. "She's got blood on her hands because she was fighting to stay alive. Any one of you going to tell me you wouldn't do the same?" The crowd's energy shifted, anger giving way to uncertainty. People began to murmur, to really look at Sarah for the first time. The blacksmith's wife pushed forward, her face pale. "Oh, honey," she said softly. "Oh, you poor thing." "I didn't want to," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. "They wouldn't stop. They kept coming, and I just wanted them to stop." Her knees finally gave out, but before she could hit the ground, Caleb caught her. His arms were solid as oak trees, and he lifted her like she weighed nothing at all. "Someone get the doctor," he ordered, "and someone else better go find the sheriff and tell him what really happened here." "Sheriff rode out to Benson's ranch this morning," someone called. "Won't be back until tomorrow." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Fine. Where does she live?" "Little cabin at the north edge of town," the blacksmith's wife said. "But she shouldn't be alone, not after this." "She won't be." Caleb adjusted his hold on Sarah, cradling her against his chest. "I'll make sure she's safe until the sheriff sorts this out." Sarah wanted to protest, to say she didn't need help from anyone, but the words wouldn't come. She felt hollowed out, empty, like all the fear had burned through her and left nothing but ash behind. She let herself rest against Caleb's broad chest, let herself be carried through the now quiet crowd. Someone picked up her basket where it had fallen, the eggs inside long since broken, the flour spilled out across the dirt. The walk to her cabin took only a few minutes, but Sarah barely registered the journey. Caleb's footsteps were steady and sure, and his heartbeat was a slow, calm rhythm beneath her ear. He smelled like pine smoke and leather and the clean, cold air of the high mountains. When they reached her small home, he had to duck his head to get through the doorway. The cabin was simple but clean, just 2 rooms with a stone fireplace and furniture her father had built with his own hands. Caleb set her down gently on the narrow bed, then stepped back, giving her space. "You got any whiskey?" he asked. Sarah shook her head. "Father never held with drinking." "Water, then, and clean cloth." He moved through her cabin with surprising care for such a large man, finding her water pitcher and a clean dish towel. He poured water over her hands, washing away the blood, his touch gentle despite the obvious strength in his fingers. "You're going to be all right," he said quietly. "What you did back there, that took courage most men don't have." "I killed them." The words came out flat, hollow. "You stopped them from killing you, from doing worse than killing." His storm-gray eyes met hers, and she saw understanding there, not judgment. "Don't you dare feel guilty for surviving." Sarah looked down at her hands, now clean but still shaking. "Everyone's going to talk. They'll say I'm ruined, that I'm not fit for decent company. Then decent company isn't worth having." Caleb set the bloody cloth aside and sat down on the wooden chair near her bed, which creaked under his weight. "You mind if I stay for a bit? Make sure you're steady?" She should have said no. It wasn't proper for a man to be in her cabin, especially not alone like this. But Sarah found herself nodding, grateful not to be by herself in the heavy silence. "Why are you helping me? You don't even know me." "I know enough." He leaned back and the chair creaked again in protest. "I've seen plenty of men who deserved killing, and plenty who didn't. Those 3 out there, they had it coming. Way I see it, you did this town a favor. The law might not see it that way. The law will see the evidence same as I did. You've got nothing to worry about on that score." He was quiet for a moment, then added, "I heard about your father. John Mitchell was a good man. I'm sorry for your loss." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes again. "You knew him?" "Some. He helped me once when I had a bad run-in with a grizzly up in the high country. Patched me up, didn't ask too many questions. Told me if I ever needed anything, his door was open." Caleb's expression softened slightly. "Guess I'm just returning the favor, looking after his daughter." They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Outside, Sarah could hear the town slowly returning to normal, the sounds of horses and wagons, people calling to each other. The sun began to sink toward the mountains, painting the cabin walls with orange and gold light. Her shaking gradually subsided, though she still felt wrung out, exhausted in a way that went bone deep. "You should eat something," Caleb said eventually. "You got any food?" "Some salt pork in the cold box, beans, cornmeal." Sarah started to rise, but he waved her back down. "I'll manage. You rest." She wanted to argue, but found she didn't have the strength. Instead, she watched as Caleb moved around her small kitchen with easy competence, building up the fire, finding her cooking pot, measuring out beans and water. His hands, so large they could probably snap a man's neck without effort, were surprisingly deft with the simple domestic tasks. "You live alone up in the mountains?" she asked after a while. "Have for about 10 years now. Don't you get lonely?" He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said, "Sometimes. But it's a different kind of lonely than being surrounded by people who don't understand you. I had enough of towns and crowds and all that comes with them. Up there, things make sense. You work hard, you survive. You get lazy or stupid, you die. It's simple." "Doesn't sound simple to me. Sounds terrifying." A hint of a smile crossed his bearded face. Maybe a little of both. He stirred the pot, then came back to sit down. "What about you? You planning to stay in Copper Ridge, work your father's claim?" Sarah hadn't really thought about it. Her father's mining claim was played out, barely producing enough to keep her fed. She'd been selling off his tools and equipment piece by piece just to get by. "I don't know. I don't have much choice. A woman alone doesn't have many options out here." "You could go back east. You got family there." "An aunt in Boston. She wrote after father died, said I could come stay with her." Sarah shook her head. "But she made it clear she thinks I've gone wild out here, that I need to be civilized again. She'd have me married off to some shopkeeper or clerk within 6 months, living in a tiny house, having babies, and keeping quiet." "That what you want?" "No." The answer came quick and certain. "I like it here. I like being able to see the mountains every morning, like knowing there's wild country just beyond the town limits. Back east, everything's so crowded, so tame. Out here, you can still feel like there's possibility in the world." Caleb nodded slowly, like she'd said something that made sense to him. "That's why I came out here in the first place. Got tired of being hemmed in, of living by rules that didn't seem to have any purpose except keeping people in line." "What did you do before you came to the mountains?" His expression darkened slightly. "Things I'm not proud of. I was a soldier for a while, fought in some ugly battles. Then I tried my hand at different work, none of it good. Finally realized I was better off away from people in general. The mountains don't judge, don't expect anything except respect." The beans began to bubble in the pot, filling the cabin with a homey smell that made Sarah's stomach growl despite everything that had happened. Caleb served up 2 bowls, handing her one along with a spoon. They ate in silence, and Sarah was surprised to find herself actually hungry. The food helped ground her, brought her back into her body after the floating sensation of shock. When they'd finished, Caleb washed the dishes without being asked, then turned to her. "I'm going to bed down outside your door tonight, if that's all right with you, just to make sure no one gets any ideas about causing trouble." "You don't have to do that." "I know, but I'm going to anyway." His tone left no room for argument. "Tomorrow, when the sheriff gets back, we'll make sure he understands what happened. After that, I'll head back up to my camp, but tonight, you need someone keeping watch." Sarah knew she should refuse, should maintain some semblance of propriety, but the thought of being alone in the dark with the memory of those men and what they'd tried to do made her stomach turn. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I mean it. Thank you for believing me." "Nothing to thank me for. I just told the truth." He picked up his rifle from where he'd leaned it against the wall. "You get some sleep. You're safe now." After he'd gone outside, Sarah changed into her nightdress with trembling fingers, then crawled under the quilt her mother had made years ago. She expected to lie awake all night, haunted by what had happened, but exhaustion dragged her down into sleep almost immediately. She dreamed of mountain peaks and clear, cold streams, of being chased by shadows that could never quite catch her, because there was always a wall of solid strength between her and them. She woke to the sound of roosters crowing and morning light streaming through her small window. For a moment, she couldn't remember why her body ached, why her arms were bruised. Then it all came rushing back, and she had to press her hand to her mouth to keep from crying out. There was a soft knock on her door. "Miss Mitchell, you awake?" Caleb's voice. She'd almost thought she'd dreamed him too, conjured up some protective spirit out of desperation. "I'm awake," she called back, then added, "Give me a moment." She dressed quickly in a simple brown dress, braided her hair with fingers that only shook a little, then opened the door. Caleb stood in her small yard, looking like he'd been up for hours. There were dark circles under his eyes, and she realized he probably hadn't slept at all. "Sheriff just rode in," he told her. "I saw him heading to his office. We should go talk to him now, get your statement while everything's still fresh." Sarah's stomach knotted with anxiety, but she nodded. She gathered her courage the way she'd gathered her shawl around her shoulders and stepped out into the morning. The walk through town felt different than it had the day before. People stopped to stare, but now there was sympathy in their eyes rather than accusation. Several women nodded to her respectfully. The blacksmith's wife actually came out of her shop to squeeze Sarah's hand and murmur, "We're all glad you're all right, dear." Sheriff Tom Brennan was a weathered man in his 50s, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner. He listened carefully as Sarah told her story, only interrupting occasionally to ask questions. Caleb stood beside her the whole time, a solid presence that gave her strength. "I talked to Doc Henderson this morning," the sheriff said when she'd finished. "He examined the bodies. All 3 men were shot from the front, and 2 of them had their guns drawn. That backs up your story about self-defense." He leaned back in his chair. "I also sent a telegram to the marshal in Helena. Turns out those 3 were wanted for robbery and assault in 2 other territories. There's actually a reward for them, dead or alive." Sarah blinked. "A reward?" $500 split 3 ways. That money's yours, Miss Mitchell. You did the law's work for them." The sheriff's expression was grim. "I'm ruling this a clear case of self-defense. You're free to go and you don't have to worry about any charges." The relief was so intense it made her dizzy. "Thank you, Sheriff." "No thanks needed. Just sorry you had to go through something like that." He stood, indicating the meeting was over. "You take care of yourself now, and if anyone gives you trouble about this, you come straight to me." Outside the sheriff's office, Sarah had to stop and lean against the wall, pressing her hand to her chest. "It's over," she whispered. "It's really over." "Told you it would be," Caleb said, but there was warmth in his voice. "What are you going to do with the reward money?" "I don't know. I hadn't even thought about it." $500 was more money than she'd ever had at one time. It was enough to buy supplies for a year, to fix up her father's cabin, to give herself options. "What would you do?" "Me, I'd probably spend it on traps and ammunition and a new coat for winter." He smiled slightly. "But you should do whatever makes sense for you." They walked slowly back toward her cabin, neither of them in any hurry. The morning was beautiful, cool and clear, with the mountains standing sharp against the blue sky. Sarah found herself noticing details she'd overlooked the day before. The way Caleb's hair caught the sunlight, the easy grace with which he moved despite his size, the way his eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, always aware, always alert. "When are you heading back to the mountains?" she asked when they reached her door. "Was planning to go today, but I can stay another night if you need me to." "No, I'll be fine. You've done so much already." She hesitated, then said, "Will you come back down sometime? To town, I mean?" His gray eyes studied her face. "I usually make it down every few months for supplies. Why?" "I'd like to thank you properly. Cook you a real meal, not just beans from a pot." She felt her cheeks warm. "If you wanted to, that is. I'd like that." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers were rough with calluses but gentle. "You're a brave woman, Sarah Mitchell, braver than you know. Don't let anyone tell you different." Then he was turning away, heading toward the livery where his horse was stabled. Sarah watched him go, this massive mountain man who'd appeared out of nowhere to defend her, who'd stayed to make sure she was safe, who'd believed her when no one else had. Something in her chest ached at the sight of him leaving, which was foolish. She barely knew him. He was practically a stranger, but he didn't feel like a stranger. He felt like safety, like strength, like the answer to a question she hadn't known she was asking. The days following the shooting were strange. Sarah found herself the center of attention in a way she'd never been before. Women who'd barely spoken to her previously now stopped by with casseroles and bread, offering sympathy and support. Men tipped their hats respectfully when she passed. The story of what had happened spread through Copper Ridge into the surrounding ranches and mining camps, growing with each telling until Sarah hardly recognized it. She used some of the reward money to buy supplies and fix the leaking roof on her cabin. The rest she saved, storing it carefully in a tin box under a loose floorboard. She didn't have specific plans for it yet, but it felt good to have options, to know she wasn't trapped by circumstances. But mostly, she found herself thinking about Caleb. She'd catch herself staring at the mountains, wondering exactly where his camp was, what he was doing, if he ever thought about her. It was ridiculous, this fixation on a man she'd spent less than a day with. Yet, she couldn't seem to stop. Summer drifted into early fall, and the aspens on the mountainsides turned gold and red. Sarah kept herself busy with her garden and her chickens, with mending and cooking and cleaning. She made friends with the blacksmith's wife, Margaret, who turned out to be kind and funny, and not at all the gossipy busybody Sarah had feared. They had tea together on Tuesday afternoons, and Margaret taught her to knit. "You're distracted today," Margaret observed one October afternoon, watching Sarah drop a stitch for the third time. "Something on your mind?" "No, yes, maybe." Sarah set down her knitting with a sigh. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course, dear." "How did you know you wanted to marry Thomas? When did you know?" Margaret's eyes twinkled. "This about a certain mountain man who came to your rescue?" Sarah felt her face flush. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to anyone with eyes in their head. The way you watched him leave, the way you've been staring at the mountains ever since." Margaret reached over and patted her hand. "There's no shame in it, honey. He's a good man from what I hear. Keeps to himself, but he's always been fair and honest in his dealings with folks." "I barely know him." "So get to know him. He said he'd come back down for supplies, didn't he? When he does, invite him to supper. Talk to him. See if what you're feeling has any foundation." Margaret picked up her own knitting, her needles clicking steadily. "But I'll tell you this. I knew I wanted to marry Thomas about 5 minutes after I met him. Sometimes you just know. Your heart recognizes something before your head catches up." Sarah thought about that for the rest of the day and into the evening. Was that what had happened with her? Had her heart recognized something in Caleb that her rational mind was still trying to understand? The intensity of her reaction to him didn't make logical sense. But then, when did feelings ever make logical sense? 3 weeks later, on a crisp November morning, Sarah was hanging laundry in her yard when she heard the sound of a horse approaching. She turned, shielding her eyes against the sun, and her heart kicked into a faster rhythm when she recognized the rider. Caleb looked exactly as she remembered, maybe even bigger somehow, his broad shoulders wrapped in a heavy coat against the cold. He dismounted with easy grace and removed his hat, and Sarah was struck all over again by the sheer presence of him, the way he seemed to fill space without even trying. "Miss Mitchell," he said, his voice as deep and warm as she remembered. "Hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all." She had to resist the urge to smooth her hair, to check if she had dirt on her face. "I was hoping you'd come by. Needed to restock before winter sets in hard. Figured I'd see if that offer of a meal was still good." His gray eyes held hers, and she saw something there that made her pulse quicken. "It's very good. Come inside. I'll put coffee on." He followed her into the cabin, ducking through the doorway, and Sarah suddenly saw her small home through his eyes. It was clean and tidy, but sparse, with few comforts. "I know it's not much," she found herself saying. "It's a good home. Your father built it strong." Caleb sat down carefully on the same chair he'd used before, and Sarah noticed he'd brought supplies with him, a haunch of venison wrapped in cloth, fresh trout packed in leaves. "Thought you might be able to use these." "That's very kind. Thank you." She busied herself with the coffee, grateful for something to do with her hands. "How's your camp? Are you ready for winter?" "Near about. Got my meat smoked and stored. Plenty of firewood laid by. Should be comfortable enough." He watched her move around the kitchen, and she was intensely aware of his gaze. "How have you been? Any more trouble?" "No, nothing like that. Everyone's been very kind, actually. I think maybe what happened changed how people see me." She poured coffee into 2 tin cups and handed him one. "The sheriff told me that 2 of those men's relatives came through town asking questions, but when they heard the whole story, they just Moved on. Caleb's expression darkened. Anyone threatens you, you send word to me. I can be down from the mountains in a few hours if need be. The fierce protectiveness in his voice made something warm unfurl in her chest. I will, but I think I'm safe enough now. She sat down across from him, cradling her own cup. Tell me about the mountains. What's it like up there? He talked and she listened, fascinated by his descriptions of the high country. He told her about watching elk herds move through the valleys, about tracking mountain lions through fresh snow, about nights so clear and cold the stars seemed close enough to touch. He described his cabin, larger and sturdier than hers, built into the side of a ridge with a view that stretched for miles. He talked about the peace of it, the silence that wasn't really silence, but rather filled with the sounds of wind and water and wildlife. Sounds beautiful, Sarah said softly. Lonely, but beautiful. It is. Both those things. He set down his empty cup. But lately I've been noticing the lonely part more than I used to. Their eyes met and something passed between them, something that made Sarah's breath catch. Before she could find words to respond, Caleb stood. I should let you get back to your day. Just wanted to stop by, make sure you were all right. You're welcome to stay for supper. The words came out in a rush. I mean, if you don't have somewhere else to be, I was going to make stew with that venison, and it seems only right you should share it. A slow smile spread across his face, transforming his stern features. I'd like that very much. They spent the afternoon together, falling into an easy companionship that surprised them both. Caleb split firewood for her while she prepared the meal, and she found herself watching the play of muscles in his back and arms as he worked, the easy power in every movement. He caught her looking once and grinned, and she blushed and turned quickly back to her cooking. The stew turned out well, rich and hearty, and they ate it with fresh bread Sarah had baked that morning. As they ate, they talked about everything and nothing. Caleb asked about her childhood, and she told him about growing up in Missouri, about coming west with her parents when she was 12, about losing her mother to fever, and then, years later, her father to the mines. He shared pieces of his own past, carefully at first, then more freely. He'd grown up in Pennsylvania, had fought in the last years of the Civil War when he was barely old enough to hold a rifle, had drifted west afterward trying to outrun the memories. The war changed me, he said quietly. Made me hard. Made it difficult to be around regular folks who hadn't seen what I'd seen. The mountains were the only place I felt like I could breathe again. Do you think you'll ever come back down? Permanently, I mean. He was quiet for a long moment. I used to think no, never. The mountains were my home, and that was that. But lately, he looked at her, and the intensity in his gaze made her heart race. Lately I've been thinking maybe there's something worth coming down for. The air between them seemed charged, heavy with things unsaid. Sarah felt like she was standing on the edge of something vast and terrifying and wonderful. Caleb, she whispered. He reached across the table and took her hand in his much larger one. His palm was rough with calluses, warm and strong. I can't stop thinking about you, Sarah. Ever since that day in town, you've been in my head. I tell myself I'm a fool, that you're young and pretty and could have any man, that I've got no business even thinking about you. But I can't help it. I think about you too. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. All the time. I stare at the mountains and wonder where you are, what you're doing. Margaret thinks I'm losing my mind. Are we losing our minds? A hint of humor lightened his voice. Both of us, maybe? Maybe. She turned her hand in his, threading their fingers together. I don't care. I'm tired of being sensible and careful. Those men taught me that life can be over in a heartbeat, that you have to grab hold of what you want while you can. Caleb stood slowly, drawing her up with him. He was so tall she had to tilt her head back to look at him, and the sheer size of him should have been intimidating, but instead made her feel safe, protected. What do you want, Sarah? This, she said, and rose up on her toes to kiss him. His arms came around her immediately, carefully, like she was something precious that might break. But when her lips met his, the care gave way to hunger. He kissed her like a man dying of thirst who'd finally found water, deep and desperate and consuming. Sarah made a soft sound and pressed closer, her hands gripping his shoulders, feeling the solid muscle beneath her fingers. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. "I should go," he said roughly. "I should leave right now before I do something we'll both regret." "I won't regret it." Sarah's voice was steady despite the pounding of her heart. "Stay, please stay." "Sarah, I can't. You deserve better than some broken-down mountain man with more scars than sense. You deserve courting and flowers and all the proper things. What I deserve is to choose for myself. And I choose you." She pulled back enough to look him in the eyes. "I know this is fast. I know it probably seems crazy, but I've never been more sure of anything in my life. When I'm with you, I feel alive. I feel safe and strong and like I can be exactly who I am. Don't you feel it too?" "I do." The admission seemed torn from him. "God help me, I do." "Then stay. We'll figure out the rest as we go." He searched her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I'll stay, but I'm sleeping by the fire, and we're going to do this right. I'm going to court you proper, Sarah Mitchell, and when we make any other decisions, it's going to be because you've had time to think, not because we got carried away in a moment." Despite the heat still coursing through her, Sarah found herself smiling. "You're a stubborn man, Caleb Stone. You have no idea." But he was smiling too, and he pulled her close again, holding her against his chest where she could hear the steady thunder of his heartbeat. They stayed that way for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, while the fire crackled and the night deepened outside. Finally, Caleb gently disentangled himself and began making up a bed by the hearth. Sarah watched him for a moment, then went to her own small bed, though she doubted she'd sleep much. She was too full of energy, too aware of him just a few feet away. "Good night, Sarah," he said softly into the darkness. "Good night, Caleb." She did sleep, eventually, and she dreamed of mountains and strong arms and a future that suddenly seemed brighter than it had in months. Caleb stayed in town for 3 days, and they spent every possible moment together. He was true to his word about courting her properly, bringing her wildflowers he'd found on the mountainside, fixing things around her cabin that needed repair, sitting with her on her small porch and talking until the stars came out. He was also true to his word about not pushing for more than she was ready for, though the tension between them built with every shared glance, every accidental touch. On the 3rd evening, he told her he had to go back up to his camp. "Winter's coming fast. I need to make sure everything's secure before the snow gets too deep." Sarah's heart sank, though she tried not to show it. "When will you come back down?" "Probably not until spring, if the passes get snowed in like I expect." He saw her face and cupped her cheek with one large hand. "But I'll come down as soon as I can, I promise. And if you need me before then, you send word through anyone heading into the high country. I'll come running. I'll miss you." The words seemed inadequate for the ache in her chest. "I'll miss you too. More than I can say." He leaned down and kissed her, slow and sweet, a promise of things to come. "But when I come back in the spring, I'm going to ask you a question. You think about your answer while I'm gone." "What question?" "You know what question." His eyes were warm, full of affection and desire, and something deeper. "Think about whether you could be happy with a life that's half in town and half in the mountains. Think about whether you could love a man who's rough around the edges and probably always will be. Think about whether what we have is real enough to build a future on." Sarah threw her arms around his neck, holding him tight. "I already know my answer." "Tell me in the spring anyway. Give us both time to be sure." He kissed the top of her head, then gently set her away from him. "I have to go now, or I never will." She watched him ride away, sitting on her porch until he disappeared into the trees at the base of the mountains. The ache in her chest was fierce, but it was tempered by hope, by certainty, by the knowledge that he'd be back. Winter came hard and cold that year. Snow piled high around Sarah's cabin, and for weeks at a time, travel in and out of Copper Ridge was nearly impossible. She kept busy with her usual tasks, but mostly she thought about Caleb, wondered how he was surviving the brutal weather, hoped he was safe and warm in his mountain cabin. Margaret invited her for Christmas dinner, and Sarah spent the day with the blacksmith's family, grateful for the company and the distraction. But when Margaret's children were opening their presents, and Thomas was smiling at his wife with deep affection, Sarah felt the loneliness keenly. She wanted that. She wanted a family of her own, wanted someone to share the holidays with, wanted to build a life with someone who understood her. She wanted Caleb. January passed in a blur of cold and snow. February was barely any better, but in early March, the weather began to break. The snow started to melt, and people could move around more freely again. Sarah found herself watching the mountain trails constantly, hoping for a glimpse of a familiar broad-shouldered figure. He came on a bright morning in late March, when the aspens were just beginning to show the first hints of green. Sarah was in her garden, turning over the soil in preparation for spring planting, when she heard the horse. She looked up, shielding her eyes, and her heart leapt when she recognized Caleb. He looked thinner than he had in the fall, his face more gaunt, but his smile when he saw her was bright as the sun. He was off his horse before it had fully stopped, striding toward her with long steps. Sarah dropped her spade and ran to meet him, and when he caught her up in his arms, lifting her clear off the ground, she laughed with pure joy. "You came back," she said, even though it was obvious. "Told you I would." He set her down but kept his arms around her. "Longest winter of my life, Sarah. I thought it would never end." "Mine too." She looked up at him, drinking in the sight of his face, the gray eyes she'd dreamed about for months. "I have my answer, by the way, to the question you didn't ask. Do you now?" His voice was warm with affection and something deeper, something that made her pulse quicken. "Yes, the answer is yes. To all of it. To a life in the mountains, to loving a rough man, to building a future together. Yes." Caleb's face lit up with a joy she'd never seen from him before. He looked years younger, the hard lines around his eyes softening. "Sarah Mitchell, will you marry me? Will you be my wife, share my life, put up with my stubborn ways?" "Yes," she said again, and then his mouth was on hers, and she was lost in the kiss, in the feel of his arms around her, in the absolute rightness of it all. When they finally broke apart, Caleb was grinning like a fool. "I need to talk to the sheriff. Make sure there's no legal issue with me taking you up into the mountains, and we should get married as soon as possible. Is there a preacher in town?" "Circuit preacher comes through once a month. He was just here last week, so he won't be back until mid-April." "That's too long," Caleb thought for a moment. "There's a preacher in Benson's Creek about a day's ride from here. We could go there, get married, and then head up to my cabin. Unless you want a big wedding with all the fixins?" Sarah laughed. "I want to be your wife. I don't care if it's in a church or a barn or the middle of the woods. I just want it to be soon." "Tomorrow, then. We'll ride out first thing, be married by afternoon, and start our life together." He hesitated. "You understand what you're signing up for? The cabin's comfortable enough, but it's isolated. You'll be miles from the nearest neighbor, cut off from town for months at a time. It's a hard life." "I don't care about hard. I care about being with you." She took his hand, threading her fingers through his. "Besides, I'm tougher than I look. I can learn to live in the mountains. You'll teach me." "That I will." He kissed her again, more gently this time. "Go pack what you want to take with you. I'll let the sheriff know what we're doing, and I'll buy supplies for the trip." They spent the rest of the day preparing. Sarah packed her clothes, her mother's quilt, her father's pocket watch, and a few other treasures. She gave the cabin and its furnishings to Margaret, who promised to look after things until Sarah and Caleb decided what they wanted to do with the property. Word spread through town quickly, and by evening, half of Copper Ridge seemed to know that the Mitchell girl was marrying the mountain man. "You sure about this, honey?" Margaret asked while helping Sarah pack. "It's not too late to change your mind." "I've never been more sure of anything." Sarah folded her wedding dress, the simple white cotton gown she'd worn to church, carefully into her trunk. "I know everyone thinks I'm crazy rushing into this, but, Margaret, when I'm with him, everything makes sense. He makes me feel strong and safe and loved. How can I walk away from that?" Margaret hugged her tight. "Then you go with my blessing. But you come visit when you can, you hear? I'll miss you." That night, Caleb slept on Sarah's floor one last time, and in the morning they set out for Benson's Creek. The ride took most of the day, and they talked the whole way, making plans for their future. Caleb described his cabin in detail, told her about the valley where he hunted, the stream where he caught trout, the meadow where wildflowers bloomed in summer. Sarah told him about her hopes for a garden, her desire to learn to shoot better, her dream of one day having children who could grow up wild and free in the mountains. The preacher in Benson's Creek was a kindly old man who didn't ask too many questions. He married them in his small church with his wife and the local storekeeper as witnesses. Sarah wore her white dress, and Caleb had cleaned up and shaved, though he'd kept his beard trimmed rather than removing it entirely. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, and Caleb kissed her, Sarah felt like her heart might burst from happiness. They spent their wedding night at the town's small boarding house, and for the first time they came together as husband and wife. Caleb was gentle despite his size, careful and attentive, making sure Sarah felt nothing but pleasure. She'd been nervous, having only the vaguest idea of what to expect, but he made it easy, made it beautiful. Afterward, she lay in his arms, feeling transformed, feeling like she'd finally found where she belonged. "I love you," she whispered in the darkness. "I should have said it before, but I'm saying it now. I love you, Caleb Stone." "I love you too, Sarah Stone." He tightened his arms around her. "Never thought I'd say those words to anyone, but they're true. You're the best thing that ever happened to me." They set out for the mountains the next morning, Sarah riding behind Caleb on his sturdy roan horse. The trail climbed steadily, leaving the settled valleys behind, entering a world of pine and spruce and rocky peaks. Sarah had never been this high into the mountains before, and she stared around in wonder at the vast wilderness stretching in every direction. It took 2 full days to reach Caleb's cabin. They camped one night beside a rushing stream, and Caleb showed Sarah how to catch trout with her hands, how to build a fire that would burn steady all night, how to read the signs that told whether bears or mountain lions were nearby. She was a quick learner, and he was a patient teacher. The cabin, when they finally reached it, was bigger than Sarah had expected, solidly built from thick logs with a stone chimney and real glass windows. Inside, it was surprisingly comfortable, with a large bed, a table and chairs, shelves lined with supplies and furs on the floor and walls for warmth. A covered porch ran along the front, and the view from it was breathtaking, looking out over a valley with a silver ribbon of river running through it and mountains rising on all sides. "Caleb, it's beautiful," Sarah breathed. "You built all this yourself?" "Took me 3 years, but yes, I wanted it done right." He set down the supplies they'd brought. "What's mine is yours now, Sarah. This is your home too." She turned to him, tears pricking her eyes. "It's perfect. You're perfect. All of this is more than I ever dreamed of." They spent the next week settling into their new life together. Caleb taught Sarah everything she needed to know to survive in the mountains. He showed her how to shoot his rifle, how to skin and dress game, how to read the weather and predict when storms were coming. She learned to preserve meat, to make candles and soap, to identify edible plants and medicinal herbs. It was hard work, harder than anything she'd done in town, but she loved it. She loved the physical challenge, loved learning new skills, loved the sense of accomplishment when she successfully completed a task. But mostly, she loved being with Caleb. They worked together during the days and came together at night, learning each other's bodies, learning how to make each other laugh and gasp and sigh with pleasure. They talked for hours, sharing stories and dreams and fears. He told her about the war, about the things he'd done and seen that still haunted him sometimes. She told him about her loneliness after her father died, about her fear that she'd spend her whole life alone. They comforted each other, supported each other, grew closer with each passing day. Summer came in full glory to the high country, and Sarah thought she'd never seen anything so beautiful. The meadows filled with wildflowers in every color imaginable. Eagles soared overhead, and elk grazed in the valleys. She started a garden near the cabin, and though the growing season was short this high up, she managed to get lettuce and radishes and herbs to grow. She picked berries and made jam, smoked fish alongside Caleb, laid in stores for the coming winter. One evening in late July, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset behind the peaks, Caleb said, "You're happy here? Truly happy? You don't miss town?" "I miss Margaret sometimes," Sarah admitted, "and it would be nice to have access to a real store occasionally." "But happy?" "Caleb, I've never been happier. This life, with you, it's everything I wanted and more." He pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. "Good. Because I was thinking, Maybe next spring we could go down to Copper Ridge for a bit, let you visit your friends, stock up on supplies. We could do that every year, spend the summers up here and maybe a few weeks in town each spring. That sounds perfect, she snuggled against him, feeling utterly content. You know what else would be perfect? What's that? A baby. Our baby. She felt him stiffen slightly, and she looked up at him. Is that something you want? We've never really talked about it. Caleb was quiet for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he said slowly, I never thought I'd be a father. Didn't think I had the right after some of the things I've done. But with you, yes, I want that. I want to see you round with my child, want to teach our son or daughter how to live in these mountains. I want everything with you, Sarah. She kissed him, long and deep, and that night they made love with a new tenderness, a new sense of purpose. And when fall came and Sarah realized she was pregnant, the joy between them was profound. The pregnancy wasn't easy. Morning sickness kept Sarah feeling miserable for weeks, and as her belly grew, she found it harder to keep up with all the work that needed doing. But Caleb took up the slack without complaint, doing double duty to make sure they had everything they needed for winter. He was attentive and protective, constantly fussing over her, making sure she was warm enough, fed enough, rested enough. I'm not made of glass, she told him one day, laughing at his concern. Women have babies all the time. Not my wife. Not my baby. He rested his hand on her swollen belly, his expression fierce. I'm going to take care of both of you, make sure nothing goes wrong. The snow came early that year, and by November they were snowed in. Sarah didn't mind. The cabin was cozy and warm, and she spent her days knitting baby clothes and reading aloud to Caleb from the few books he owned. He rubbed her back when it ached and her feet when they swelled, and at night he held her carefully, protectively, like she was the most precious thing in the world. The baby came in early February, during a blizzard that rattled the cabin walls and piled snow 3 feet high against the door. Sarah went into labor at dawn, and Caleb, despite all his wilderness skills and survival knowledge, looked absolutely terrified. I don't know how to do this, he said, his face pale. Sarah, I've never delivered a baby. What if something goes wrong? Nothing's going to go wrong. She gripped his hand through a contraction, breathing hard. You've delivered foals and calves. It's the same basic idea. It's not the same at all. But he gathered himself, falling into the calm competence he showed in any crisis. He heated water, gathered clean cloths, helped Sarah through each contraction with steady hands and encouraging words. The labor lasted all day and into the night. Sarah had never known such pain, such exhaustion, but Caleb never left her side, never stopped telling her she was strong. She could do this. They were almost there. And finally, as the blizzard began to ease and the first stars appeared in the clearing sky, their baby came into the world with a lusty wail. A boy, Caleb said, his voice choked with emotion. Sarah, we have a son. She was crying and laughing at the same time as he placed the baby in her arms. The infant was red and wrinkled and perfect, with a thick shock of dark hair and lungs that worked just fine, judging by his cries. Hello, little one, she whispered. Welcome to the world. Caleb sat on the bed beside her, his arm around her shoulders, staring at their son with wonder. He's so small. How can anything be that small and survive? He'll grow, and he'll be strong like his father. She looked up at Caleb and saw tears on his bearded cheeks. What should we name him? I was thinking John, after your father, if that's all right with you. Fresh tears spilled down Sarah's cheeks. That's perfect. John Stone, little John. They sat together for a long time, the three of them, while the fire crackled and the wind whispered outside. Sarah felt overwhelmed with love, with gratitude, with the sheer miracle of what they'd created together. This tiny life, this perfect baby boy, he was the embodiment of everything they'd built, everything they meant to each other. Caleb bent down and kissed her forehead gently. Thank you, he whispered, for this, for him, for giving me a family I never thought I deserved. We deserve each other, Sarah said firmly, all three of us. We're meant to be together. The months that followed were exhausting but wonderful. Little John was a healthy baby with a good appetite, and his father's powerful lungs. Sarah and Caleb took turns walking him when he was fussy, and Caleb proved surprisingly adept at soothing the baby, holding his tiny son against his broad chest and humming in his deep voice until John fell asleep. When spring came and the snow melted, they made the journey down to Copper Ridge as planned. The trip was harder with a baby, but they managed it, and the welcome they received made it worthwhile. Margaret cried when she saw Sarah and met little John, and the whole town seemed to celebrate the mountain man and his wife and their beautiful son. They stayed 2 weeks, long enough for Sarah to reconnect with her friends, for Caleb to trade furs and buy supplies, for everyone to admire the baby and comment on how happy Sarah looked, because she was happy, radiantly so. The shadows that had haunted her after the shooting were completely gone, replaced by confidence and joy. On their last night in town, Margaret hosted a dinner for them. Over dessert, she said to Sarah, "I worried about you, you know, when you rode off into those mountains with a man you barely knew. But look at you now. You're glowing." "I found where I belong," Sarah said simply. "With him up there. It's home." "And you're not afraid? Of being so isolated? Of what might happen if something goes wrong?" Sarah looked across the room at Caleb, who was letting one of Margaret's daughters tug on his beard while he held a sleeping John in his other arm. "I'm not afraid of anything when I'm with him. He's the strongest, bravest, kindest man I've ever known, and he loves me and our son more than anything in the world. What is there to be afraid of?" They returned to the mountains, to their cabin and their life together. Summer passed in a blur of work and play and watching John grow. He was a happy baby, always smiling, always curious about his surroundings. When fall came and Sarah discovered she was pregnant again, she and Caleb were delighted, though Caleb immediately went into protective mode again, insisting she rest more and work less. Their daughter was born the following spring, an easier birth than John's had been, during a gentle rain that washed the mountains clean. They named her Rose for Sarah's mother, and she was tiny and delicate with her mother's dark hair and her father's gray eyes. John, now a toddler, was fascinated by his baby sister and wanted to help with everything. The years flowed by like water, each one bringing changes and challenges and joys. They added a room onto the cabin for the children. Caleb taught John to track and hunt and fish, and Sarah taught him to read and write using books they bought on their annual trips to town. Rose grew into a bright, fearless little girl who could climb trees and catch frogs and wasn't afraid of anything. They had a third child, another son they named Thomas after the blacksmith who'd been such a good friend, and then a fourth, a daughter they called Margaret after Sarah's dear friend. The cabin rang with laughter and sometimes tears, with the sounds of children playing and learning and growing. Sarah and Caleb grew older together, their love deepening with each passing year. There were hard times, certainly. There was the winter when they nearly ran out of food and had to ration carefully until spring. There was the summer when John broke his arm falling from a tree, and they had to ride down to town for the doctor. There was the year when sickness swept through the family and they all struggled with fever. But mostly there was joy. There were quiet evenings on the porch, watching the sunset while the children played. There were mornings waking up wrapped in each other's arms, still reaching for each other after years of marriage. There were holidays celebrated with just their family, intimate and perfect. There were the annual trips to Copper Ridge, where they maintained their friendships and the children got to experience a taste of town life. Margaret became a second grandmother to Sarah's children, and her own kids grew up alongside the Stone children, cousins in spirit if not in blood. The town of Copper Ridge never forgot the story of how Sarah and Caleb came together, and it became something of a local legend, the tale of the brave woman who fought for her life and the mountain man who defended her honor. When John was 15, a strong young man already showing signs of his father's size and strength, he asked, "Pa, Ma never told me the whole story of how you two met. Will you tell me?" They were sitting around the fire on a winter evening, all 6 of them, and Caleb and Sarah exchanged glances. "I suppose you're old enough to hear it," Caleb said. "Your mother was in trouble, being accused of something she didn't do. I helped her, and we fell in love." "That's the short version," Rose piped up. She was 12 now, clever and perceptive. "I heard Mrs. Margaret telling Mrs. Johnson that Ma killed 3 men." Sarah stiffened slightly, and Caleb reached over to take her hand. "Your mother defended herself against men who meant her harm," he said firmly. "She was brave and strong, and I loved her from almost the first moment I saw her. That's the important part of the story." Did people really shout that she had blood on her hands? Thomas asked. He was 9, fascinated by adventure stories. They did, Sarah said quietly. They were scared and angry, and they didn't understand what had happened. But your father stood up for me. He told them I was fighting to stay alive, and he made them listen. Because it was the truth, Caleb said, and because I couldn't stand by and watch them hurt someone who'd already been hurt enough. Little Margaret, only 6 years old, climbed into Sarah's lap. I'm glad Pa helped you, Ma, otherwise we wouldn't be here. Sarah hugged her youngest daughter close, tears pricking her eyes. I'm glad too, sweetheart. So very glad. That night, after the children were in bed, Sarah and Caleb stood on their porch looking out at the star-filled sky. The mountains rose around them, silent and eternal, and Sarah thought about how far she'd come from that terrified woman standing in the street with blood on her hands. Do you ever regret it? Caleb asked softly. Giving up town life, living so far from civilization? Never. Not for a single moment. She turned to face him, reaching up to cup his bearded cheek. You saved me, Caleb. Not just that day in town, but every day since. You gave me a life beyond anything I imagined. You gave me love and family and purpose. How could I regret that? I'm the one who was saved, he said, pulling her close. I was half dead inside, just going through the motions of living. You brought me back to life. You taught me how to love, how to be part of something bigger than myself. You're my heart, Sarah. You always will be. They kissed under the stars, as deeply in love as they'd been on their wedding day, maybe more so. Because this love had been tested and proven, had grown stronger through challenges and time. It was a love that had created life, that had built a home in the wilderness, that had turned 2 lonely people into a family. The years continued to pass. John grew into a man and eventually married a girl from Copper Ridge, building his own cabin just a few miles from his parents' place. Rose surprised them all by deciding she wanted to study medicine, and she left to apprentice with a doctor in Helena, though she came home to visit regularly. Thomas and Margaret were still young, still learning and growing under their parents' guidance. Sarah's hair began to show threads of silver, and Caleb's beard turned more gray than brown. They moved a little slower, their bodies bearing the marks of years of hard work and mountain living. But their love never wavered, never diminished. If anything, it grew richer, deeper, more essential. On their 20th anniversary, Caleb took Sarah on a trip to a high mountain lake he'd discovered years before, but never shown her. They left the younger children with John and his wife and rode up into country so beautiful it took Sarah's breath away. The lake was crystal clear, reflecting the peaks like a mirror, and wildflowers covered the meadow surrounding it in a riot of color. This is where I came after I met you, Caleb said as they stood hand in hand by the water's edge. That first time, after I left you in Copper Ridge, I came up here to think, to figure out what I was feeling. And I realized that my life had changed completely in the span of one day, that I'd found something worth coming down from the mountains for. Sarah leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. I knew that day too. I knew you were going to be important to me. I just didn't realize how important. That you'd become my whole world. You're mine, he said simply. You and our children, you're everything. I thank God every day that I happened to be in town that afternoon, that I was there to help you. It wasn't chance, Sarah said softly. It was meant to be. We were meant to find each other. They camped by the lake that night, making love under the stars like they were young newlyweds again, laughing at the creaking of their joints and the gray in their hair, but finding the same passion, the same connection they'd always shared. And Sarah thought that this was what love was supposed to be. Not the breathless rush of new romance, though, that had been wonderful, but this deep, abiding knowledge that you'd found your person, your home, your forever. More years passed. Margaret grew up and married a young trapper, staying close to her parents in the mountains she loved. Thomas decided he wanted to try his hand at ranching and moved to the lower valleys, though he visited often. Rose became a doctor, one of the few women practicing medicine in the territory, and Sarah and Caleb were immensely proud of her. Grandchildren came, adding new life and laughter to the cabin. Sarah taught them the same things she'd taught her own children, and Caleb showed them how to live in harmony with the wilderness. The legend of how Sarah and Caleb came together grew with each generation, becoming a family story told and retold, a reminder of courage and love and choosing your own path. When Sarah was in her 50s, a reporter from a newspaper in Helena came to interview her. Someone had told him about the story of the woman who'd killed 3 men in self-defense and then married a mountain man, and he wanted to write about it for his paper. Sarah agreed, though she was nervous about raking up old memories. But when the reporter asked his questions, she found herself talking freely, telling the whole story from beginning to end. She told him about the fear and the accusations, about Caleb stepping in to defend her, about falling in love and building a life in the mountains. "Do you ever think about those men you killed?" the reporter asked. "Do you have regrets?" Sarah considered carefully before answering. "I regret that it happened at all, that men like that exist in the world. But I don't regret defending myself. I don't regret surviving. If I hadn't fought back that day, I wouldn't have this life, this family, this love. So no, I don't regret it. I'd do it again if I had to." "And your husband? What made him stand up for you when everyone else was ready to condemn you?" "You'd have to ask him that. But I think he saw the truth when others only saw the blood. He looked past the surface to what was real. And he's been doing that for me ever since, seeing the best in me even when I couldn't see it myself." The article, when it was published, caused something of a stir. People debated whether Sarah had been right to kill those men, whether Caleb had been right to interfere, whether their love story was romantic or scandalous. But Sarah didn't care what strangers thought. She had what mattered: a good man who loved her, children who'd grown into fine adults, a life well lived. Caleb and Sarah grew old together in their mountain cabin. Their children and grandchildren visited often, and the cabin was never quiet for long. But they still made time for each other, still took walks together through the woods, still sat on the porch in the evenings talking and holding hands. On a summer evening, when Sarah was 65 and Caleb was 68, they sat on that porch watching the sunset like they had thousands of times before. Caleb's hair was white now, and his movements were slower, but he was still strong, still the solid presence Sarah had relied on for more than 30 years. "Do you know what I was thinking today?" Sarah asked, leaning against his shoulder. "What's that?" "I was thinking about that day in town, when you first saw me, when I had blood on my hands and everyone was shouting. Do you remember what you said?" "I said a lot of things that day. You said I was fighting to stay alive, and you were right. But what you didn't know, what I didn't even know then, was that I wasn't just fighting to survive that moment. I was fighting my way toward you, toward this life. Every choice I made, every time I refused to give up, I was moving toward this." She gestured at the mountains, the cabin, the life they'd built. "Toward us." Caleb was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "I wasn't living before I met you, Sarah. I was just existing. You taught me what it meant to truly be alive, to love and be loved, to be part of something bigger than myself. You gave me purpose and meaning and joy. You gave me everything." "We gave each other everything," she corrected, turning to kiss him. His lips were familiar, beloved, still capable of making her heart flutter even after all these years. They sat together as the stars came out, as the night birds began their songs, as the mountains stood watch around them like they had for millions of years and would for millions more. And Sarah thought that this was enough, more than enough. This was everything she'd ever wanted, and more than she'd ever dreamed possible. The life she'd fought for on that dusty street in Copper Ridge when she'd stood with blood on her hands and terror in her heart. The life Caleb had defended, had helped her claim, had shared with her through joy and sorrow, through challenges and triumphs. The life they'd built together, one day at a time, one choice at a time, one moment of love at a time. It wasn't a perfect life. There had been hard times and sad times and moments when Sarah wondered if they'd make it through. But it was their life, chosen and fought for and cherished, and that made it worth everything. As they finally headed inside for the night, Caleb paused in the doorway and looked back at the mountains one more time. "You know what I love most about this place?" he asked. "What?" "It's where I found you, where we found each other. These mountains brought us together, and they've kept us together all these years. They're not just our home. They're part of our story." "The best story I know," Sarah agreed, taking his hand. The one where the mountain man saved the woman everyone thought was a murderer, and she saved him right back. And they lived happily ever after. Caleb smiled, that rare, warm smile that still made Sarah's heart skip a beat. Not quite ever after, not yet. We've still got years left, you and me. Still got time to watch our grandchildren grow, maybe meet some great-grandchildren. Still got time to love each other. Then let's not waste a single moment, Sarah said, and led him inside, closing the door on the night in the mountains and opening it on another evening together, another night in the life they'd built, another chapter in the story that would be told for generations to come. The story of how Sarah Mitchell stood with blood on her hands while the town shouted accusations, and how Caleb Stone stepped forward to say she was fighting to stay alive. How they fell in love against all odds, built a life in the wilderness, raised a family, and proved that sometimes the most beautiful things come from the darkest moments. That sometimes the person who saves you is the one you didn't know you were waiting for. That love can heal even the deepest wounds. That courage and strength in choosing to fight for what matters can change everything. And that happily ever after isn't a destination. It's a journey you take together every single day until your days run out. A journey Sarah and Caleb took with joy and gratitude and love that never faltered, never dimmed, never failed. They lived the rest of their days in that mountain cabin, surrounded by family and beauty and the wild country they had always loved. And when they finally passed, years later within months of each other because neither could bear to be without the other for long, they were buried on a hillside overlooking the valley, under the peaks that had witnessed their love story. Their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren continued to tell the story, passing it down through the generations. The story of Sarah, who defended herself and refused to be shamed for surviving. The story of Caleb, who saw past the blood to the truth. The story of a love that began in tragedy and grew into something beautiful and lasting. And every time the story was told, it ended the same way. With Sarah and Caleb together in their mountain home, having built a life of meaning and purpose and joy. Having proven that love, real love, the kind that sees you at your worst and loves you anyway, the kind that stands up for you when everyone else turns away, the kind that grows stronger with time instead of fading. That kind of love is worth fighting for, worth living for, worth everything. And Sarah and Caleb had found it together, had nurtured it, had let it transform them both, from two broken, lonely people into a family, a legacy, a love story for the ages. All because on one terrible day in Copper Ridge, Montana, in the summer of 1876, a mountain man looked at a frightened woman with blood on her hands and chose to see her truth instead of her guilt. Chose to defend her when she couldn't defend herself, chose to believe in her when no one else would, and she, in turn, chose to trust him, to love him, to build a life with him that exceeded both their wildest dreams. That was their story, their truth, their happily ever after, and it was enough, more than enough. It was everything.